Welcome to the I Say All That. Wait a minute. That's the wrong
Trying to
script.
rip it off.
I know, ripping it off already. Sorry about that.
Welcome
to the Lost Boys to Found Fathers podcast. I'm Gabe O'Sullivan, and joining me is my co-host, Will Haycox. And today we are joined by John Andrews, host of the I Say All That to Say This podcast. We are men who have suffered the loss of a child, and through this production we desire to offer encouragement, strength, and hope to our fellow brothers who have traveled the same journey. I want to thank y'all so much for joining us today, and John, I want to thank you for joining us today from the I Say All That to Say This podcast. And before we get into this today, I just want to say, I don't know what happened on the sound last episode. We thought that it would be a really good idea to record in the bottom of an empty metal pool. So we took our equipment to the bottom of the pool where Will was skateboarding later in the day, and somehow we had this massive echo. So I don't know what happened there, but at least you got to hear everything twice. So hopefully it sunk in. So I'm gonna throw it over to Will.
Thanks, Gabe. Yeah, we just want to thank you all for listening and getting to this point. I think this is episode 27, so we are very grateful to be to this point, and we're blessed to have all of you along with us. And we want to just get started here pretty quick, but we were talking before the podcast, so we just want to give you a heads up in case you're not aware of what we're talking about here in this podcast. It's the first episode that you've jumped into. We're talking about child loss and infant loss, and so this may be a tough thing for you to hear if you're not prepared for that. And we're gonna get into what really happened and John and his wife's experiences with miscarriage. And so if that's something that you're not prepared for, go ahead and turn this podcast off now. We hope that you're here to hear some real stories of guys that have been through this stuff, the same thing that you have, and that you are ready to open your heart and hear what we have to say. So with that said, welcome, John. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks, guys. Good to be here.
We just want to get started right. We already said your name's John Andrews. You're from the I Say All That to Say This podcast. And I want to just open the floor and let you tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from, and kind of how'd you get here to Spartanburg, South Carolina?
I came to Spartanburg when I was 18. I came to be a student at Wofford College, I have to say that. But I was also a basketball player and finished up there, went a year at Converse to get my master's in education. They do allow men. Now it's not as funny a joke. Back then, people would look at me crossways when I said I went to Converse. But they actually allow men into the graduate program, and so I got my master's there, started teaching high school in the upstate, and taught and coached for 8 years before God called me into full-time ministry.
That's cool. Tell us about your family.
My wife and I just celebrated our 25th anniversary back in July. Actually got to celebrate our anniversary on the mission field. It's the first mission project we had done because of COVID in the last year and a half. So we were able to go to the Middle East, and we were able to celebrate our anniversary there. We have 2 kids. My daughter is just turned 21 last month. That's hard to believe. And she is working part-time, going to school full-time here locally. My son is a freshman down at Charleston Southern. He's going to be running track down there.
Cool. We want to let you tell the story of your children here, but first, just for any listeners that are not believers or just anyone that's curious, could you give us a short overview of your testimony?
Yeah, I was running a drug ring in my church nursery, and I was the baddest dude on the block, and wanted nothing to do with Jesus, and I always kind of
baby Tylenol.
There you go. Yeah, baby aspirin and maybe a squeegee full of NyQuil or something like that. But I always joke with people. We kind of toss around this idea of testimony envy. We think, the worse you were before you met Jesus, the better the conversion. And that's not true. New life is new life. Period. It's a miracle. It's nothing that we're capable of ourselves, and so I actually was 4 years old. Sometimes people look at me and they're like, really? But I remember still to this day, and I'm older than 4 now. In fact, I'm older than 44 now. But I remember to this day, my dad was a pastor. So we were always at church. I did have a drug problem growing up. No kidding. My parents drugged me to church every time the doors were open. Do you have like a sound?
We'll add
sound
that.
effect?
We'll add that later.
Okay, yeah. Edit that in. But it was a Sunday night. We got to church early, of course, hour or more, like we always did. And I just told my parents. I said, I know that I need Jesus, and I want to ask Him into my heart. And there was no magic in this, but we still, and my dad's a pastor, so I guess he felt like he had to. We walked down to we were in the back of the sanctuary at the time, and we walked down to the altar, and my sister was still in a baby carrier, so we left her in the back. But me and my parents went down and knelt at the altar, and I gave my life to Jesus when I was 4. And never really had a time of rebellion. There were dry spells, certainly, where my relationship was not where it needed to be. But never, even in college, not really a time of rebellion where I ran away from Jesus, and been a part of various ministries along the way. Obviously grew up as a pastor's kid, was not your traditional pastor's kid, but I was a leader in my youth group and that kind of thing. And FCA, high school, college, different traveling ministry teams, all that kind of stuff. And all that was just, looking back, it was all preparation of where God has me now. But I met my wife at FCA at Wofford. She played at a school down the road, and I remember we got kind of put into our own little prayer group that night. She had a basketball keychain, and the keys were sitting on the ground, on the carpet right beside her knee. We were all sitting, I guess you can't say Indian style now. You have to say crisscross applesauce. Back then, we were sitting Indian style. And I glanced down, I saw her keychain, and my first thought was, man, this woman's beautiful. She's at FCA, so I assume she's a Christian, and she must like basketball. Where do I sign up, right?
Yeah.
And in the midst of the conversation, I asked her, I said, do you like basketball? She said, well, I actually play basketball. So we got married in July of 1996. And we had some stumbles along the road. Child-wise, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then my daughter was born in 2000. My son was born in 2003. And we've just been walking this journey out ever since, trying to figure it out.
That's cool. Thank you for sharing that. I just want to say, too, you mentioned the testimony envy, and it's funny. I actually just started hosting a small group at our church, and we kind of have that dynamic between myself and my co-leader, where I have that flashy, juicy testimony of growing up in church and falling away and trying a lot of different things, and then coming back. And he's got the more traditional testimony that you have, where he grew up in church, he had some struggles and, dealt with temptation, but he's been a believer since a young age. And so he kind of jokes back and forth, this is, if you want to hear the good stories, listen to him and all that. And I think, like you say, maybe that makes more of an impression on some people, but at the same time, I didn't become a believer until I was 23, 24. So I wasted a lot of my life and chasing the desires of the flesh and not serving the Lord. So I think that's wonderful. And obviously, if I could go back and change my own personal history, then I would have become a believer earlier and served the Lord longer. But He has me, like you say, where He needs me now, and prepared me through all those struggles that I went through.
Well, and you're not alone. We've met a bunch of people through the years with our ministry, and people coming from all over the map, literally. And several people. One who probably top 3 testimonies I've ever heard from, oh my gosh, what you did before you met Jesus, and then what a radical experience it was when you met Jesus, and what a crazy different person you are now. I remember we were having a conversation, and he asked me, what's your story? And I was like, well, and I kind of shied away. I was in Sunday school and by BBS and blah. And he said, man, I have so many scars from all of my bad decisions. And it's made me who I am, and it's made me so grateful for what Christ did in my life. But he said the exact words you did. He said, I wasted so much of my life, opportunities that I could have been doing what you're doing. And here I am thinking, I should have gone crazy for a while, and it would make my story more flashy, like you said. but that's not the case. And you know, God, our journey is one that God has us on, and He's got a plan for our lives. And so you use your journey as a ministry tool, and I think that's what you guys are doing here on this podcast as well.
That's right, man. That's what, and that's exactly what we kind of keep going back to that verse about how God, you know, allows us to comfort others with the comfort that we have received. You know, because we've all received. We also have some kind of ministry, you know, that God's given us, and it might be a ministry like, like Will said, where man, there was this time of rebellion and whatever in life that then God brought him through, and or it might be where, hey, God just, you know, thankfully had His hand on us from the beginning, or from an early age, that we were then able to continue walking with Him, and that itself is a ministry as well. And so, and as we get into today, you know, wanting to be a comfort to guys out there that have gone through infant loss, that there might not be any other material out there specifically aimed for men, you know, and that's why we're trying to step into the gap right there. And so that's, and again, that's specifically why we asked you on here. You and I know each other a long time.
Yeah.
And the first, really the first time we got to know each other was in an airport on the way overseas to do a basketball trip. That was many moons ago, and when my right knee would actually work properly, and my left hip worked a lot better at that time as well. And I remember, you know, we didn't really know each other, and sat down at some, you know, some little table in a airport, and you kind of shared with me, you know, your story, because you had heard a little bit about our story,
Right.
and you said, hey man, I just, you know, want to encourage you. I've been down a similar path, and here's our story.
Well, I can remember it was my birthday. I'm not exactly sure. It was 98, I believe. And I just let my kids out to go to lunch, and this girl who played on the girls basketball team, she came in after everybody had walked out with a present. Well, it's my birthday. It's not unusual for my students to give me presents, right? She just wasn't one of my students, and I thought, this is kind of weird.
So you're immediately thinking of the Police song, the young teacher.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Don't stand so close to me.
That's right.
That was it.
But she said, here you go, Coach. And I opened it. She just turned around and walked out, and I thought that was even stranger. I opened it, and there was a bib in the present, and it was a picture of a sea lion spinning a ball on his nose. And the bottom of it said, my daddy is so sealy. Get it? Sealy? Yeah. And I thought, what in the world? And I looked up, and my wife's standing in the doorway. And I said, no way. And she kind of had tears in her eyes, and she shook her head yes. And so we hugged, and I got some people to cover my last couple of classes. Once I started telling people, all the teachers were like, yeah, you need to get out of here. Y'all need to go celebrate. We got your classes. So we went out to lunch that day and celebrated. And the next day, I told all my classes. I told the faculty and staff, you know, hey, we're having a baby, blah, blah, blah. And I was excited, you know. I was proud. It was unexpected, but I was excited. And then about 4 weeks later, we went for ultrasound so that we could hear the heartbeat of the baby, you know, about 12 weeks in. And just kind of check and make sure everything's going okay. And the nurse is doing the ultrasound and kind of scanning all over my wife's stomach and everything else. And she just kind of had this puzzled look on her face. And she said, hang on, I'm going to go get the doctor. And, you know, my wife said, hey, immediately, she said, something's wrong. Something's wrong. And I said, no, you know, don't invent trouble. You know, let's wait and see. And sure enough, doctor came in. He said, well, you know, and he's very academic and very cold and very sterile, you know, and no emotion. And he, you know, I remember him saying these words, well, the fetal pole is only showing 7 weeks of growth, but you are 12 weeks into your pregnancy. I said, Doc, stop. Are you saying our baby died 5 weeks ago? And he said, yeah, that's what I'm telling you. And we had no idea, obviously. And so a couple days later, they scheduled, you know, the D&E, and and went back to the hospital, and they removed the baby, and it was all very cold again, very sterile, and not just physically. Obviously it had to be for the procedure, but it was emotionally sterile almost. For me, I women, and the three of us sitting here have gone through the same thing, but we don't understand how women immediately form that bond with their children. I was excited, and I told all my kids the next day, but I didn't. When I would go home and think, "Oh my goodness, we've got a baby coming," and we're barely 2 years married. I'm not sure if we're ready, and I know the house isn't ready, and I don't know if I'm ready to be a dad. And that was the plan. It was just not that soon. And so all these questions going through my mind, and at the same time, my wife's just kind of going deeper and deeper emotionally, connecting with this baby that's growing inside of her. And then all of a sudden it's taken out, literally, and she was distraught, and she was really, really, really struggling, and I didn't understand it. I was sad, but I didn't have the connection she did, and she really struggled. And having talked about it after the fact and looking back at it, she struggled a lot longer than I thought she had struggled. Questioning all kinds of things, which is natural, right? God's not afraid of hard questions. In fact, having spent time all over the world and spending time with people in other countries and cultures, most of them say you don't ask questions of insert God, little g God name here, right? But God very clearly in His Word says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." Jesus talks numerous times throughout the Gospels, "Test me in this, try me out, seek me." That means question, look, investigate. He's not afraid of hard questions, and that's where she was during that first miscarriage.
And so you mentioned how we as guys just don't understand that bond. We just don't, because the baby's not inside us,
right?
And so when you sense that she was having a hard time emotionally, maybe harder than you, like, how did that look for you, being able to be there for her? Or was there like a disconnect because you were like, I don't know what she's going through, I don't get it, like, did this time help your relationship? Did it draw you closer together? Did it draw you apart? Like, how were y'all able to connect during that time?
I would probably have to say both, and it's weird to say both. I can remember laying on the bed with her, and she's just kind of rolled up in a ball, and she'd been crying and that kind of stuff, and my mom called. And this was a day or two after we found out. And my mom called, and I got the phone, and I walked into the other room because I didn't want her to hear. And she's asked me questions, and I can remember telling my mom, I just don't understand why it's hurting her so deeply, because it's not hurting me that deeply. I'm sad, but she can't get out of bed, right? And so there was that disconnect. I could not empathize with her, right? But I could sympathize with her. And so even though there was a disconnect in our emotional state, I knew she needed me, and I recognized it as an opportunity for me to show her how much I loved her. Just lay there beside her, get her food, do whatever, cancel things that she had to be involved with and that kind of thing, and just take care of her in all the various ways, and show her that I loved her during that time, even though I didn't really understand what she was going through.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing that you bring up there, and I don't know, maybe just the way you said it, but I don't know if it would stick with everyone else the same way, and they want it fleshed out like I would, but you said you couldn't empathize, but you could sympathize. Could you, I think that's a common thing that I know my wife and I dealt with a little bit. Could you flesh that out a little bit more? What did that feel like? Did you feel disconnected from your wife, but like you say, maybe emotionally you weren't in the same place, but you knew that she needed you? I think that's that's probably a place where a lot of guys are for a long time, for weeks or months or however long. I think that's something we could take a little time on.
Yeah, definitely. Women, generally speaking, are more emotional than men. At least they show it more. We tend to bottle it up and not show it. You mentioned the big nasty V word when you started, Gabe. You said if you're willing to be vulnerable, that's not something we embrace very often, and I think that even goes to the next level. So, we have a shared experience in common bond, even though you and I just met this morning. Will, we still have that common bond and are okay in opening up in this context. It's not something we embrace, generally speaking. And when we sense, at least this was my experience, when we sense that my wife needs me, I don't have time to be vulnerable, right? Even though that might be medicinal for me, I'm not going to be that way right now because my wife needs me to be strong. And so, at least in my case, recognizing her need for strength and her need for me to be there for her, I almost felt like I didn't have the opportunity. And again, we were not in the same place emotionally. And so even if I had time to do a deep dive into my feelings and everything else, I wouldn't have felt what she was feeling because it was our first. But I still just kind of pushed that aside for her sake. I don't think I was trying to avoid it myself. But I felt at that moment, and I've since learned otherwise, but I felt at that moment that I needed to be strong for her and not show any emotion to protect her, right?
Yeah, I understand that. That's a similar place I was in as well.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think that's exactly what we have to be strong for our women in this scenario. For particularly, I mean, consistently, but they do eventually want us to open up, and to be vulnerable for them. But I remember kind of a scenario. We were still in the hospital. I guess our girls had been born. They were in the NICU, and Ryan's parents were going to go get us some dinner or something, so we didn't have to eat the hospital food, and you know how it is when a lot of times on, date night or whatever, and it's like, where do you want to go to eat? I don't know. Where do you want to go to eat? I don't know. Where do you want? I don't care. And as Christians, we're like, let me serve you by not caring, whatever. And I just remember her dad being like, what do you want to eat? And I just remember saying, go to Capri's. She wants this sandwich. She wants this side. She wants this drink. She wants this salad. She wants this dressing. And then I remember later, like randomly, Ryan was like, that was the most decisive that you have ever been for me on a, and it was some little thing like about where she wanted to, but it was all about being her strength at that time when she didn't even know what she wanted to eat, whatever. And so we have to be there for them and be strong for them, but then eventually we have to be able to be like, okay, I'm gonna lay aside my stoicism, to then be able to connect with them and let them know, and we've talked about this a lot, to let them know that we do care, even though we don't understand and feel what they're feeling, and I know that you were able to do that.
Well, and I learned, unfortunately we had 2 more opportunities to learn this process, and really even 3.5 total, but I realized it, because you want to love your wife the way she needs to be loved. And the better you get to know your wife through the years, the more you know how to love her, right? And my wife is a functioning introvert. She's great with people, has great influence with people. She's a great speaker, teacher. But if she has to prepare and spend time around a group of folks, and small talk is her biggest fear, to be honest. She can stand in front of thousands of people and go at it and not have a problem. But if she's got to meet with 3 or 4 of them afterwards and just, hey, how are you? That wears her out. So after something like that, I have learned to say, hey, I love you, so I'm going to leave you alone. Like, if I love you, I want to be with you, right? My kids are in relationships right now, and they're putting thousands of miles on their car and staying up late at night and all that kind of stuff because they're in love, right? But that's their love. They're loving them like they want to be loved. But I think the true depth and maturity of love is when you recognize how the other needs to be loved. And I didn't know that at the time. We've been married 2+ years. First miscarriage. I didn't understand all this. This is hindsight. This is life experience teaching us. But as we had the opportunity, unfortunately, to do this again and again, I recognized some of those things that, okay, I've been strong, I've been stoic, to use the word you used a second ago, Gabe. It's now time to let her inside,
That's right. And you mentioned your wife being able to stand in front of thousands of people and speak. So I know why she's had those opportunities. Would
Right.
you like to share that a little bit?
Okay. Well, we had 2 more miscarriages after the first one. In fact, our second one was my next birthday. Happened the same exact thing.
My goodness.
I got she didn't go to the degree of sneaking around and giving my present to somebody to deliver it to me at school, but she ended up giving me a present for my birthday and opened up. It was the same bib.
Wow.
A year later, and I thought, what?
Wow.
And she kind of smiled, and so I picked up right where I left off. So I was a lot more ready day one for our second child than I was our first child, and then and something else that we stumbled across and learned from our first time. I told you I told all of my kids and all the faculty and staff the next day. Well, it was about 4 weeks later that we had the miscarriage, and I was coaching basketball at the time. And I can remember 3 or 4 weeks after our miscarriage, we had our year-end banquet. And so my players had told their parents that we were having a baby. And so they'd come up, how's your wife? How's the baby? And you pause because I'm getting ready to lay something on you that's going to make you feel awful, and I'm going to feel awful.
Right.
And you're going to feel awful because you think you're making me feel awful too. And that happened time and time again because we would see people at church, that we would only see at church, and maybe they missed a week and we missed a week, whatever, and then it's 2, 3, 4 weeks later, and they're asking how the baby is. Well, we lost the baby, and they feel terrible, you feel terrible. So we kind of learned from that and kind of kept quiet with the second pregnancy. Got to the point where we felt like it was safe. That we went and got the ultrasound where we could hear the heartbeat, and that was a major benchmark for us because we'd never been there.
Sure.
And then we slowly started telling people, and then within a week or two, she started having some really bad abdominal pain. It was late on a Saturday night, and I'm like, let's go to the hospital. She said, no. And so we called the doctor, and are you doing this? You doing this, and whatever. And so she ended up going to the bathroom, and she miscarried in the toilet. And again, I think that's why he gave the disclaimer. But not only was I more emotionally prepared for the second one immediately because of the first one, but it was rougher on me because I'm on the phone with the doctor, and he said, well, we need to know if it was the baby or if it was just a blood clot or something. And so I had to dig down in the toilet and look and see that it was the baby, and then had to pull the trigger and flush it at one point. And so that was hard, much harder for me than the first one was. And we both wrestled, and I think that's when we began to grow together because we were sharing that grief and sharing that hurt. I had been stoic. I had been strong because I thought that's what I was supposed to do as the husband, as the protector. And then we just hurt together the second time, and that connected us. And then about 6 months later, she was on a school retreat. She had gotten pregnant again, and a couple of weeks after we found out she was pregnant, she was on a school retreat. She called crying and said, "You got to come get me. I just did it again." I just did it. Those were the words, and she said, "I just did it again." So I realized that she's struggling with something a lot different than I am because she's thinking it's all my fault. I wasn't wrestling with that, but that was something new even on this third time that realized that she was blaming herself for it. And so that's something we kind of walked through. And then about a year and a half later, we went to for the 20-week ultrasound of our fourth pregnancy, and to find out, we'd done the heartbeat. ultrasound, we're marking off these weeks, and we're getting more and more excited because maybe it's finally going to work this time. And we go for the ultrasound to find out the sex of the baby, and we find out that her leg wasn't developing properly. The nurse said that the leg was about half the size. Her left femur was about half the size of her right femur. There really wasn't much else. They had no idea what was going on, no idea why this was going on. He called us in. The doctor called us in and said, let's do a couple tests. Come back next week. We'll do a couple tests, and we need to rule out some things. But because that first miscarriage was so sterile and it happened in the hospital, they were able to kind of investigate and find out why we had the initial miscarriage, and it was a chromosomal issue. So when he found that out, he said the likelihood of that being the case here is pretty strong. And he said, and I can remember, my wife was sitting in his office in front of his desk. He was sitting at his desk, and I was having to stand beside her because we walked in, there was only one chair in front of the desk. And he had a kind of a high back chair over by the corner. I grabbed it and started pulling it over so I could sit beside my wife. He said, don't move my furniture. So I had to stand there by my wife while she's sitting, and he's giving us this news. And he said, when he said that it's probably this chromosomal issue, he said babies that have this, they're almost all miscarried in the first trimester, which we had encountered. He said, but babies that make it this far almost always will go full term. But they'll die within 2 weeks.
Oh, shoot.
And he said, so we need to talk about options.
My goodness.
And I said, no, there is no option, right? And he said, no, you don't understand. And he started telling me all this stuff that could go wrong and was going to go wrong. And I said, no, you don't understand. Abortion is not an option for us. And I said, if we lose a baby between now and then, or the baby lives 2 weeks or 47 years, she belongs to him, you know. And that was a moment where I didn't know it. Again, we've retold this story time and time again, as you mentioned, Gabe, when she ended up writing a book about it. And I didn't know at the time, and she has admitted this since to the groups when she speaks, that and it's come full circle because, you know, as Christians, as those that believe in the sanctity of human life, sometimes we just, if anybody is even considering that, there's something wrong with you. And she said, and this is part of her story, at times, and in that office that day, and I didn't know it, I was just doing what I felt like I was called to do and what I felt strongly about. She said there was a moment of doubt where I thought, I don't know if I can go all through all this again. And she said, and she says many times, if it weren't for you standing up for me, I'm not sure I could have made that decision.
Yeah.
And so that has grown her heart for the mothers that have to make the decisions, because sometimes it's not just they're evil and they want to kill every baby that's ever been conceived. It's the circumstances, you know. And so one of her platforms is, you know, care for the mother, not just let's just save every baby we can. Let's try to help some mothers along the way. They had a chance to testify in front of the Senate subcommittee several years ago. She and my daughter, and right before, there was a mother who had several abortions, and she was there promoting abortion and giving a testimony because it was a bill that was going to allow, because they had come to the point where they realized that at 20 weeks, babies can feel pain. 20 weeks in utero, and so our baby was that way. You know, when they did the amnio to test for some various things, they stuck the needle in, and she shied. We were watching all this on ultrasound. She shied away, went over if there's a corner of the womb, I don't know, but she shied away, and then it was almost like it clicked. Wait a minute, you're invading my space. And we watched her reach up and grab the shaft of the needle.
Holy moly! And
she's shaking it. And the doctor's hand on the outside actually moved.
Wow.
And he just was, and this is the same guy that recommended that we have an abortion a week earlier. And his jaw dropped, and he did what he did, and took the sample and pulled it out. And I said, because he had told us, baby's going to shy away and stay away from needle. Because my wife was worried about injuring the baby, and he said, no, they're going to go away. They're always afraid of anything intruding their space. And she just reached up and was like, get out of here, dude, And we knew we had a fight on our hands at that point. But, a few weeks later, she was born with her leg, again, hadn't developed properly. I struggled because in that 10, 12-week period between the ultrasound and once all the tests were done and everything else to the time she was born, I'd convinced myself, because I was on my knees every day, God heal her. And we're both teaching and coaching. We have those communities that are following our story and that kind of thing, our home church. And I said, if you heal her, I'm going to yell from the mountaintops the miracle that you had done. And honestly, I was thinking way too small, because that would have been the 1,500 people at my school, and the 1,500 people at her school, and the 1,500, 2,000 people at our church. And I could have yelled that God did a miracle, but even then, some people that doubt were like, the ultrasound was wrong. Doctors were just mistaken. There's no miracle here. And so she was born. Her left leg wasn't developed properly, and we didn't have any idea what was going on. 7 different kinds of doctors looked at her in her first 3 days of life, examined her, and the 7 different kinds of doctors came up with 5 different diagnoses, and none of them were right. Finally, they did a biopsy at 10 days and found out that there was a malignant tumor that had developed in her hip and thigh and restricted blood flow to her leg, which is why her leg didn't develop properly. And this was early on. So we find out that our baby has cancer at 10 days old. And the second question is, well, my wife must have cancer too. And they assured us that was not the case. She started chemo at 2 weeks. We went through 3 cycles of chemo. She's had, I don't know how many different surgeries, 2 major surgeries to extract the tumor. But she's an incredible young lady, and she's swam for her high school. She even competed in a couple of track meets. They had asked her to compete it's her senior year at a major high school here in town, and she was, they wanted her to compete in the wheelchair, the trike race at the state meet. We didn't have one of those at our school, but they wanted her to compete at the state level. But we found out that she had to compete in 2 track meets in order to be eligible to compete in the state meet. Well, there were no wheelchair races, and so she threw the shot put and the discus in a couple of track meets, trying to compete for that. She's an amazing young lady. Loves Jesus. Has spent time overseas with us. Obviously, has spent time overseas by herself in her journey, and so back then we were just thinking way too small. But God's done some amazing things through her and through her story and in her even, and we're still excited to see what's coming.
Cool. Yeah, we appreciate you sharing that. There's a lot that I wrote down several notes here that I'm trying to figure out which question to ask you next, which path we want to go down. We're already at 42 minutes. I think we're shooting for around an hour here. Just try to respect your time.
Oh, so we did have an hour. I thought we only had 30 minutes.
Oh, Gabe's trying to cut you short.
Yeah, well, that's Gabe's job.
Yeah.
There's a reason that my podcast is called I Say All That to Say This.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Gabe's trying to cut you short, and I'm like, man, I don't have to be anywhere till 9. So we got 30 minutes here. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's things that you said, you had to learn how to love your wife the way she needed to be loved, and the way that would help her grow and would help her feel encouraged and would build your relationship. And the first thing I thought of was, your wife may have preferred that you had done some things differently, or if you had known what was best for her at the beginning, you may have done some things differently, and maybe she wouldn't have appreciated those things because she thought she wanted things done a different way. And my thought was, that's what God has done to us. That, like you said, you were praying for healing for your daughter, and that you wanted everything to be perfect when she came out. And, the same thing for my wife and I, and I know for Gabe and his wife, that, we were just praying healing. We want the doctors to be wrong. We want there to be healing,
Yeah.
and we'll proclaim your name through that and what you've done for us. And if we don't know how things would have turned out, but most likely, if my son had not been stillborn and Gabe's girls had not passed on, we wouldn't be here.
Right.
And whatever 10 guys, 50 guys, 100 guys, however many people have listened to this, wouldn't have the chance to hear our stories and to know that there are people that are going through this as well and are here to encourage them. So, I think that's an important point, to realize that God isn't this genie who we can just pray to and say, hey, make this thing right. And then it happens. That sometimes maybe God is loving us the way that we need to be loved, the way that's best for us. And that's hard for us to see that from our perspective. And I think that's an important thing we need to keep in mind, that God doesn't love us maybe the way we want to be loved, but the way that we should be loved.
Yeah. I, as you're talking, I'm reminded of the night that we found out that she's 10 days old, and we'd just gotten the results back. All of our families were in the hotel room, the hospital room. We were not in a hotel. And the doctor came in to give us the news that she had cancer. And I remember Wendy just collapsing in my arms, and her parents were smart enough to say, hey, let's give him some time. And we just kind of melted into a puddle on the floor. And the transition from the first miscarriage, I need to be strong for my wife, is what she needs, to at that moment I knew she just needed me to be there and hurt with her, and we just cried together for a long time. And when my mother-in-law walked out of the room, she called our pastor's secretary to tell our pastor what had happened. And he actually, story goes, he was at dinner with a friend in Colombia and just got up from the dinner table and left to drive straight to the hospital. And we had some people tell us, some good things, quote scripture and, speak truth over us. And in times like this, it's really hard to find the right words, and some people had done some unintentional harm in sharing some of the things they shared. And it hurt, but removed from the situation, you're like, all right, they were just trying to love us best way they knew. And so as our pastor's riding up the road and we know he's on the way, I'm thinking, all right, if anybody knows what to say, it's Mike, because he's been in these situations so many times and has walked through so many tragedies with so many families. And I remember more than what he said afterwards, this phrase. And he walked in, he had a tear in his eye because he knew what was going on. And it was just the three of us in the room. And he pulled up a chair, and I'm expecting him to say, in Leviticus chapter 12, the Lord says, and he just starts to cry. And he said, guys, I wish I could tell you I knew why this was going on and why y'all were having to go through this, but I have no idea. And by this time, this journey's, 4 or 5 months. We're 4 or 5 months into this journey because of all this started with the ultrasound at 20 weeks. And so he was aware, he knew what was going on, and he said, I wish I knew what was going on, but I don't. I don't have the right words, so I'm just going to sit here and cry with you. And I thought, man, if someone who has been in almost every imaginable tragedy over the last 20, 25 years doesn't know what to say, I'm probably not going to know the right thing to say when one of my friends is in the midst of tragedy too. And it's that picture of going from the first miscarriage, when I was trying to be strong and do what I thought was right, to we find out that our daughter has cancer, and we just fall on the floor together and cry together on that hard tile floor because that's what she needed, and that's what I needed. And just the growth of that, I think, is experience talking. You don't have to have the right words to say. And he said he followed up by saying this. He said, I wish I knew why this was going on. I wish I had the words to tell you. I don't. But I will tell you this. God's plan for our lives are so intricate and so, he wrote our stories before our stories even came to be. We read in Psalm 139. Every day of my life was written down before one of them came to be. And he said, days or years from now, you're going to see why this is going on. but there's no way to know now, and I don't have the words to tell you. And I told you I was thinking way too small when I wanted her to be born with 2 healthy legs, right? And what God's done with her and in her and around her and in the lives of people that have known her since, it just made that all the more true.
And man, I just want to say, like, I think you brought up a good point there, even with the pastor saying, I don't know why you're going through this, because so many times, like, guys just think, or anybody can think, oh, because I'm following Christ, then, or if somebody's not a Christian, because I'm a good guy, my life's just going to be good.
That's
like,
right.
It should be easy,
That's right.
because I'm not, doing X, Y, or Z, or whatever the case may be, then life's going to be easy. But that's not biblical, right? That's just not the way that it is. And so that's why I think that's important that guys hear that. It's like, if you're going through this doesn't mean that it's necessarily because you've done anything wrong.
Right.
Like you had said, Wendy was kind of blaming herself, or I did this again, or it happened, what did she say? I did it again, right? That it's not that you're being punished, or it's not that there's, something going on, but likewise, or on the flip side of that, rather, it's not because you're following Christ or because you're a good guy that your life should be easy. It doesn't. There's nothing that says that's going to be the case, and so it's hard to think or to come up with those answers of why am I going through this, particularly when you're going through it. And we may never know, but then, like you just said a minute ago, years down the road, or weeks down the road, months down the road, whatever, those pieces of that puzzle start to come together, and you're like, okay.
Well, I want to say this to somebody who might be listening and is not years down the road yet. When we heard some of those words of encouragement from our pastor, words of encouragement from our friends and our family who were speaking truth, were speaking scripture, in my mind I knew that was true and I knew it was right. It just didn't help me feel any better at the moment. And that's okay.
Right.
You're not supposed to be, somebody's not, there's no secret formula or secret magic words that somebody says, okay, it's all better now. That's a process. And there's nothing wrong with the process there's nothing wrong with you because it takes a process, and there's nothing wrong with you because the process takes years, right? This is not something that you're supposed to just immediately get over.
Yeah, when Gabe said that, it's not your fault, it's not a result of your sin that you suffer always. I thought of the story of Jesus healing the blind man, and he goes to the temple and they're asking questions, who sinned, was it this man or his parents that he was born blind? And Jesus says, he was born blind so that God could be glorified through his blindness. And,
well, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's not to say, oh, now I know that my son was stillborn and that you had 3 miscarriages, and that's because God is glorified through that, so I'm good. That's all I need to know. But there's also a great amount of hope that we can take in that this isn't all just random coincidence, and it's not our fault, and it's not something that we could have done differently, if we were better people, or, there's just some ethereal thing out here floating that maybe good things will happen to you, maybe bad things will happen to you, but we can take solace in the fact that God has a plan and things happen because that's part of his plan, and ultimately he'll be glorified through them.
Well, when you were talking about the blind guy, Jesus healing the blind guy, I thought this is where you were going. I love the blind guy's response when they asked him, who is this guy? What happened? He said, I don't know who he is, and I don't care. I was blind and now I see. And I think that's something that we miss a lot of times, is how powerful our own personal testimony can be, how powerful our stories can be. And, his story for the rest of his life was, I don't know who this guy was. Some people called him, maybe Jesus, I think they said. I don't know. But he just said, see, and I saw, and I couldn't before. And he didn't really care about anything else because God had changed his life. And that's what he retold over and over again the rest of his life. And so I don't care what the reason was, and there's some speculation, and but even in the midst of the surgeries that came after, and them thinking they pretty much knew exactly how everything happened, at that point in time, I didn't care. God had already begun to do a work in her life and through her story
And that's all we cared about. We didn't care about how cool the intricacies of the surgery was. And and there were 5 or 6 different doctors involved in different surgeries. I still think about the neurosurgeon in the second surgery looking over the shoulder of the surgeon, the pediatric surgeon who was doing most of the extraction of the tumor. And they're down at the bottom of the spine. Gabe, you know this well. And the nerve endings that come out and kind of finger out. Well, the tumor had fingers of its own and kind of begun to intertwine with those nerve endings on your spine. And so they were worried about paralysis. And they're retelling the story. And, he's the neurosurgeon's looking over the surgeon's shoulder, say, "Hey, cut right there. Oh, don't mess with that one. That's good. Leave that one alone. Cut right here. Cut right here." And he's like backseat driving during the whole surgery, And looking back on it, I was like, man, that is crazy incredible. But at the time, I didn't care. She still could move her legs. She could still feel when we tickled on her foot and that kind of thing. In fact, the neurosurgeon kept coming back to check on her the days after the surgery. And about the 4th or 5th day, he did that little tickle thing on her foot, and she kicked him in the nose. And he said, "Well, I guess she's good now. My job here is done." But I didn't care about which nerve ending went to what and what possibly.
Right.
God used their skill and blessed them with their knowledge to heal my daughter. And it's like that blind man. I don't care who it was. I can see now.
Yeah, I think, we've got a little more time here. I want to wrap up some of these questions that we've got and just kind of touch on wherever they lead. You had mentioned, that you and your wife were dealing with things differently, in the midst of your struggles with miscarriage. And I guess, is that my question here is, what was your biggest regret through that time? And then what are you most thankful for through that time? And I don't know, would your biggest regret be that you tried to be so stoic at first and you weren't connecting with your wife the way that you later learned she would have appreciated? Or, how would you explain those? And then how would you advise someone to steer clear of that if they're going through this as well?
That's a deep question. I think probably thinking that I needed to be strong for her the very first miscarriage, and missing out on the potential connection that we could have had in sharing our hurt was probably the biggest regret I have from that first one. And then the third miscarriage kind of blurred. It happened. I wasn't even there. She was out of town. I had to go get her and that kind of thing. But the way the second miscarriage ended, and then fast forwarding to the times that we found out, one, that her leg wasn't developing properly because of at the ultrasound, and then finding out that she had cancer and she was going to have to start chemotherapy at 2 weeks. And those moments were all just moments where we grew because we were just crying and hurting together. I think in my years of marriage, we dated 3 years before we were married, so we've been together for 28 years. So I feel like I know her pretty well, and I've gotten to know her better through the years. But protecting your wife is something we're called to do as men, right? But knowing how to make, and honestly, and this goes back to that first miscarriage. You protect your wife. Well, if some dude walks in the house with a gun, I'm taking the bullet, right? Or I'm taking him out so that he doesn't hurt my family. That's protecting, and that's the elementary version of what protecting your family means. But just and she and I have had these conversations since, when we hurt together, when we cried together, and it, that's Savannah will be, the end of this month, she'll be 20 years cancer free. And that's an incredible story to have told years ago, and still to this day, obviously. But we've gone through hardship since, right? And she has said these words to me where the fact that I know you're hurting just like I am, there's protection in that. She said that because there's we, meaning she and I, have created this bubble, if you will, where we're hurting together, and that protects us because we're not neither one of us are singled out, right? We are sharing. We know what each other's feeling, and protect each other because of that. And so hurting with her protects her feeling, her sense of loneliness. So I think that's probably the biggest point is recognizing that protection is not just keeping the strong man out of the house, right, or the bad guy away from your family. It goes a lot deeper than that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I know it's a thing that I had to learn myself. Still learning. My wife and I are just 2 years removed from our son being stillborn, so we're still dealing with that, dealing with the hurt and connecting through that, and like you said, learning to love each other the way that we need to be loved. I wanted to jump, and we can maybe rapid fire a couple of these. I want to respect your time. But what are were there any particular Bible verses or stories from the Bible or truths from the Bible that were helpful for you in maintaining your relationship with the Lord and dealing with this in a God-honoring way?
One of the things that's always stuck out to me since, let me say this first. When our pastor was in the room with us that night and just crying with us, he read Isaiah 43 and said, "You'll go through the waters, but you won't drown. You'll go through the fire, but you won't be burned. I'm with you." That's paraphrase, obviously, but those words have kind of stuck with us, and we've been able to use those words to speak truth in the lives of people going through struggles ever since. But I think recognizing that, Gabe, we've been overseas playing basketball, teaching basketball. That's a skill, right? Some of us are more skilled than others, right? And just for the record, and I said this week in your presence, so I'm not just for you guys listening, in case they've said anything on previous podcasts, and I haven't listened to every single one of them, but if Gabe's talked about his basketball acumen, Gabe is probably the best sub 6 foot post player I've ever played with. So I'll give him that shout out. There you go. But recognizing not only your skill set and your passions that God's given you and the way He's equipped you and the spiritual gifts that you're blessed with, and you're supposed to use those for His glory. I think your story is the same thing, right? The things that you've gone through and the way that you've been chiseled and sharpened and molded as you've walked through those tragedies are molding you as a tool to be used later for God's glory in the lives of people that are going through the same thing or similar situations, right? And I think, and that more comes after. I don't think you're in the middle of, you had a miscarriage and the next week, I'm going to use this story to benefit somebody, be a blessing to somebody else 2 years down the road. You don't think of it then. But as you get past some of the hurt and some of the intensity of the moment, you realize that my story, just like your testimony, we started talking about that, just like your testimony, my story and my journey can help speak truth in other people's lives, can help encourage them as they go through the same thing. But I would say this is the first one that came to mind when you were talking about Scripture. Being outside of past that moment and looking back, there were so many people praying for us that God was protecting us, and I didn't even know it. Wow. And I think about the picture of Moses. Not Moses. Abraham on the cliff overlooking the battle, and God said, "As long as your arms are up, then we'll." Nope, I am. I'm sorry. It's Moses. Yes, I thought I'd correct myself. My wife's gonna be mad for me. Yeah, it is. You only got me one cup of coffee. But Moses is holding his hands up, but he gets tired. When he gets tired, he drops his hands, and the Israelites began to lose the battle. And that's where his brothers come along and hold his arms up for him, and so they hold his arms up. And they win the battle. I think there's two pictures there. One is the people that literally come alongside of you and hold your arms up when you're in the midst of a battle. I think that's key. Having those folks that will come alongside of you and hold your arms up. And then the flip side of that is you don't even really sometimes know what you're going through, because I remember as my son was born 2.5 years later, I remember one night we were in his room, I was changing his diaper, and yep, I did that a couple times.
You're such a wuss, man.
Yeah. I remember it was at a moment when Savannah was going through her chemo, to keep her, you would know this, white, red, I don't know, blood cell counts up while she's going through fight off infection. We had to give her shots each day. My wife doesn't do needles, so that fell on me. And, of course, she only had one healthy leg, and we had to give it to her in her leg, so I had to just keep puncturing the same thigh, juicy, fat thigh every day. And she's crying, and that was really a hard thing for me in the moment. But then fast forward 2.5, 3 years later, and I'm changing my son at about that same age, and I'm looking at him down on the changing table, and I'm thinking, how in the world could I have continually, day after day, stuck a needle in his little leg? I don't have any idea how I did it. And I realized then, man, God was working in ways we didn't even know because of the prayers of his people, for our protection. And not just, Savannah would survive and she would thrive and be past this cancer and all that kind of stuff. But God was protecting us in the moment. We didn't even know it. Just from the intensity and the immensity of the moment. Because it, looking down at my son, it's like there's no chance in my own power I'm able to just stick that needle in the same leg day after day after day and just watch my daughter, who is already struggling, crying because I made her cry, And 2.5, 3 years later, I realized, whoa, God really shielded us from some of that. So, and that was from the prayers of his people. That was from the prayers of people coming alongside of lifting their arms up.
That's amazing. I want to give you just a few minutes here if you would like to share about your ministry. I'm not sure how much you want to share on this podcast, but I just want to open the floor up for you to share a little bit about it, maybe how the Lord led you through everything that you've been through and how that prepared you for your ministry, and just give you a chance to talk about that if you'd like to.
And about the podcast and about your upcoming book.
Okay. Well, I mentioned a second ago, God equips us in various ways. Played college basketball, was coaching basketball, coached football for a couple of years at the high school level, even helped with golf some. And if there's anybody that happens to hear that is probably laughing. But that has seen me on the golf course. But I loved sports. I played every sport growing up, and I was on the field or on the court every chance I had. Even on off days when I was playing at Wofford, we'd have an off day. I'd go play pickup somewhere. Just loved it, And as I began to teach and coach, I realized that I could use that as a ministry tool. I really felt like God called me to be a teacher and a coach when I was in college. And that was my mission field. And Lord knows the public schools are a mission field. And I was in the middle of my ministry when I began to do short-term projects overseas. But what it was, I began to see the lostness around the world where people had never even heard Jesus' name before because someone else decided for them they were never going to have a chance to hear. We all know people that aren't walking with Jesus now because that's their choice, right? They know the truth and they've chosen to live their life a certain way. But I was meeting folks trip after trip that had no idea who Jesus was, and it was not because they decided not to go to church on Sunday. It's because there were no churches. There was no gospel presence. They knew no Christians. They had never heard the story. And in most cases, it was either in governments or cultures where someone else had decided for them. And so that all kind of molded together and became a situation where I realized that I could use sports as a way to get into those places that traditional ministries can or won't go. And you guys know that sports just automatically creates relationships. And whether you can speak the same language or not, we all speak ball, right? And so you can walk out on a court with guys you can't communicate with verbally and still function and play a game, or on a baseball field or football field, whatever it is. And God began to kind of give me a glimpse of how He could use the passions and skill set that He'd given me years ago to reach the nations. And so that's when we started Impact Sports, and as a result of Impact Sports, we would go overseas. I told you before the podcast started, this summer we did our 70th overseas trip to the Middle East. Not just to the Middle East, but all over the world, but this particular trip was to the Middle East. And that's just counting one trip over basically the last 2 years because of COVID. But because of COVID, we've not been traveling, near as much. Pre-COVID, we were doing 6-7 international trips a year. We do 10 or 12 weekend prison trips a year. We go into prisons and play softball, basketball, volleyball, whatever it is, our men, women, and just build relationships. And through those relationships, share Jesus. And so we were kind of going crazy schedule-wise, and then all of a sudden it comes to a halt. And Gabe told me we went to lunch a week before quarantine actually hit in March, and he knew that people had been on me about writing a book and kind of collecting these God stories through the years of just amazing things that He's done on the mission field and on the lives of people that went to the mission field. And I remember you said, "Have you started your book yet?" I said, "No, not yet," kind of sheepishly looking down. I said, "No, not yet." And he said, "Well, do it." And I had just this picture of Ben Stiller and I think Starsky and Hutch. Do it.
Do it.
Do it.
Do it. Do it.
But ashamedly, I was able to limp through the rest of 2020 and not do it, actually. And so Gabe enlisted some help, to some reinforcements to help force me to start writing in January. So I actually went away for a weekend in January to start kind of compiling this book. And then the idea of the podcast came up. And we started in March, and it wasn't even on my radar, the beginning of 2021. And I think we just aired episode 20 on Tuesday. It comes out the first and third Tuesdays of every month. It is called I Say All That to Say This, so this people understand. Not all of our episodes are this long. Some of them are shorter. We intentionally keep them shorter just like you guys do, but you can see why. Probably listen to me why it's called I Say All That to Say This. But we have we finished the book. It's in the editing process and publishing process, and so November 16th the book will be released. And the name of the book is Utterly Amazed, Stories from Outside the Boat. And that comes from two passages of Scripture that God gave me early on. Utterly Amazed comes from Habakkuk 1:5. First 4 verses of Habakkuk 1, the prophet is complaining to God about letting evil reign in the world and people getting away with doing bad things and all that sort of stuff. And that same could be said right now, right here, right? But God says in verse 5, He says, "Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told." And then you combine that with the story of Jesus walking out on the water, meeting the disciples during the storm on the Sea of Galilee, and Peter steps out of the boat and walks on water, does what no other man's ever done, simply because Jesus said, "Come," right? And so combining those two are the kind of the foundational principles of who we are as a ministry. And so we're hoping that the book and the podcast, but the book particularly, we want to do two things. We want to brag on Jesus, just celebrate what He's done that nobody else could do or orchestrate. We want to brag on Jesus. We want to point people to Jesus, and we want to help motivate people to step out of their own boat and see God do some crazy things in and through them as well.
Cool. Well, we appreciate you taking your time to come and speak with us and share the story of your children and your family. And we hope everyone listening to this hears our stories and our hearts in this, that Gabe and I have been vulnerable about. We're not perfect. We certainly still have struggles and temptations, and we're real guys. We've been through real things that you're dealing with, and same for you, John, that you've been through things that a lot of people could probably relate to, unfortunately. And we hope you guys know that you can reach out to us at any time. You can check out his podcast, I Say All That to Say This, if you want to continue following John. And just get in touch with us, please. Let us know what you think of this podcast and other podcasts. And Gabe, you want to take us out?
Absolutely. Again, John, thank you so much for joining us today. Make sure y'all look for his book, which will be released on November 16th. And also make sure you follow Lost Boys to Found Fathers on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can check out my book, Thy Will Be Done. You can get that on Amazon. Just type in Thy Will Be Done, put a question mark at the end of that, and type in my name, Gabriel O'Sullivan. That should help you come up. Again, thanks for joining us today. Let's not be lost. Let's be found in him.